In this video, I'm going to share my process for painting my latest Snow Tiger commission and talk about some of my techniques for painting realistic looking snow. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. The reference for this painting was provided by Michelle Cobble, an American photographer. Remember, if you're painting from other people's photographs, you must always ask for permission to use them before you start painting. I always start my wildlife paintings with the eyes. I start with a burnt umber wash and then begin to draw around the basic structures using black paint. I block in the dark layers of colours, then build up to a complete eye with various thin layers of paint. My previous video has a full tutorial of how I paint tiger eyes in acrylics. If you want to learn more about my technique, I'll put a link to that video in the description below. Next, I move on to the nose. This time, I start with a thin wash of red mixed with black. Again, I draw my basic shapes with black paint, and then block in my underlying colour much darker than I want the final outcome to be. I do this so I can build up the colours from dark to light. By leaving small gaps between the subsequent layers, it can add depth to your painting and make it look much more realistic. When painting noses like this, I use a mix of red, yellow ochre, black and white. I dab the lighter colours on top of the darker colours to give the appearance of wet, bumpy noses. For the muzzle, I start by drawing in the outline and dark marks where the whiskers will sit. I then use burnt umber to block in the areas where I want the orange fur to be. Because most of my tiger will be covered in snow, I'm only blocking in the parts that are visible. At this stage, because I want the paint to be opaque, I'm not using any water to thin it down. As with all my paintings, I begin my fur by adding black lines using an angled brush, painting them in the direction that I want the fur to go. I then paint on top of this with thin washes of burnt umber mixed with black and white. I make sure to leave gaps between the brush strokes to leave some of that base colour and the black marks showing through. For the white sections of the muzzle, I start with thin washes of grey paint. This is usually just black mixed with white. In this case, I've also added a little bit of burnt umber to give this initial layer of fur a much warmer feel. I'm going to be painting snow on top of this, so I want that snow to appear much cooler than the tiger's face, so I need that fur to have a warm tint to it. When I'm painting fur like this, I'm always studying my reference photo very closely. I want to make sure that I'm being as accurate as possible and that my brush strokes are following the form of the face. I'm also very careful when I paint the fur, making sure the brush strokes are not too uniform and not all going in straight lines. I try to curve the hairs slightly in different directions and leave gaps to show some of the fur underneath, which gives it a more 3D look and the impression of layered fur. I gradually build up the details using a combination of the angle brush and a small detail brush, getting lighter and lighter with each subsequent layer. As I've already mentioned, most of my painting is going to be covered in snow, but there are some regions where some of the fur will be showing through. I decided to create a rough base layer of orange fur that I would eventually paint over and turn into snow. I covered the canvas in this base layer because I didn't want any bare canvas showing through in the final painting. Any parts that I missed when painting the snow would just look like orange fur showing through, so it would save me a lot of time in the later stages of the painting. I always start painting tigers by blocking in the stripes with black paint, then washing over the fur with a mix of burnt umber and black. Next, I use the round brush to give the impression of fur by painting in rough marks using a mix of burnt umber thinned down with water. Again, I start these areas very dark so that I can paint on top of them with much lighter marks to establish layers and add depth to sections of my painting. So in this case, I just added some white and yellow ochre to the burnt umber to make those lighter colours. The next part of the painting was a new technique for me. It was something that I wanted to try out, and honestly it wasn't very successful. I decided to paint the areas that I wanted the snow to be a very saturated blue colour first. I thought that would allow some of that cold blue colour to show through in the final layers of the painting. I really messed up doing this, and I realised it was a massive waste of time. I spent far too long trying to cover up the blue to make it look whiter like the snow in those final layers. Really, I should have just started with grey. My plan was to gradually build up layers of grey on top of the blue, gradually getting whiter and whiter until it eventually resembled snow. The technique did work in the end, but I definitely don't recommend it. I learned a lot about painting snow from this painting, and there are a few things that I would do differently if I was to paint it again. So I thought I'd share with you some of my tips if you wanted to paint snow like this. Firstly, definitely don't start off with that super saturated blue base colour. It's much more hassle than it's worth. If I was to paint snow like this again, I would definitely start with a mid to light grey colour and maybe just add a few drops of blue to my paint mix to cool it down a touch. When I was blocking in the snow, I used an old bristle brush. The ends had frayed slightly, which made it perfect for dabbing the snow to give it a fluffy look. I made sure to twist and roll the brush in my hands as I painted. This meant that each time I put the brush to the canvas, it was in a slightly different position and the snow didn't all look the same. As I was blocking in these base layers of snow using that brush, I made sure to leave gaps for the layers underneath, just as I do with fur, to let those layers show through slightly to give the painting a more 3D look. As I mentioned before, I added very small amounts of blue to my paint to give it a much colder feel. As I got to the final layers of the snow, I still had slight mixes of blue and grey. I never used pure white at this stage. It's really important to realise that snow is not just smooth masses of white. There's loads of dips, bumps, hills, channels and structures made by the wind, sun, rain, and in this case, the movement of the tiger. It's really important when you're painting snow that you think about the structures that snow is sat on top of. You want to make sure that the snow is still following the 3D forms of those shapes underneath. It's why I like painting the fur first, then painting the snow over the top, so that I can visualise exactly how that snow might look over the section of fur that I've just painted. After painting the snow on the face, I had to work back in the details of the fur showing underneath. To do this, I used the small detailed brush and the angled brush. All I did at this stage was use burnt umber mixed with black, and applied the paint in the areas where the fur was showing through on the reference picture. I wasn't painting any fur detail, I was just carefully blobbing and smoothing out the paint in the correct areas to give the impression of the colour of the fur showing through the snow. I also used the detail brush to glaze the shadowy areas of the snow. I used a mix of black, blue and burnt umber to create a cold dark grey colour, then used very thin washes of this to add the shadows. Because the snow is a 3D shape, it's really important that we think about the shadows that the sun would cast on it and the areas of light to really establish the form of those clumps of snow. I neatened up the snow using small angled brushes. First, I added layers of cold icy blue, then I used some slightly watered down white paint to add the finishing touches. I used pure white and watered it down slightly so that it was still bright but not too opaque. This meant some of the colour underneath still showed through and the finished outcome didn't look pure white. I repeated this process for the rest of the painting, bringing back some of the fur using burnt umber, then refining the snow using light blue and white. For the snow on the muzzle, it was really important to consider the roundness of the cheeks and the location of the whiskers. I wanted the snow to still show the form of the muzzle and take into account the snow that would stick onto the whiskers and clump together, forming little mounds. I built up the snow detail in exactly the same way as the rest of the face, making sure to vary my brush strokes every single time. What I noticed was when I started to dab the paintbrush repeatedly, it tended to start to leave marks that looked exactly the same. By rolling the paintbrush in my fingers slightly to change the orientation of the brush, I managed to get more unique looking marks. A new tool that I've just started using a lot of is an airbrush. It's fantastic for glazing. I've not quite got the knack of adding detail, but to add shadows and white and general washes of smooth paint, it's fantastic. So in this painting, I used the airbrush to add some white over areas of the darker fur. This gave the appearance of smaller powdery snowflakes sat on top of the fur. I really recommend using an airbrush if you want to paint soft snow. It makes it so much easier. Next, I moved on to painting the chin. I followed the exact same process for the chin as I did the rest of the fur. I added the shadows for the snow using a glaze of blue and black, then built up the snow using the angled brush and various combinations of blue, black and white paint to make the icy blue-grey snow. This section of the painting is actually my favourite, as I think I managed to capture the form of the chin and managed to layer the snow to give it a 3D look, which is exactly what I was going for. For the loose strands of fur underneath the chin, I used the dagger brush. Then, one of the really important finishing touches was to add small snowflakes using the detail brush. All I did was dab small blobs of white paint onto some of the loose fur strands, where I thought that snow might land and stick to the fur. For the whiskers, I started using the liner brush to add dark brown and black whiskers. I used the liner brush here because the darker whiskers appeared much thicker. I then went on to use the dagger brush using thin white paint to add the lighter whiskers. To finish the whiskers, I used the detail brush to add small snowflakes just like I did with the chin and the muzzle. For the final finishing touches, I used the dagger brush and watered down black paint to glaze some hairs above the eyes. Here's the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed these tips about painting snow and that they help you with your work. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and found it useful. You can find more art tips over our website www.studiowildlife.com. As always, thank you for watching and remember to subscribe to Studio Wildlife for more wildlife art tips.